I told you this wasn't easy to get to. Got a makeshift bridge here. I don't know how anyone back in the day lived without off. Welcome to Galveston Unscripted. Okay, I'm in my office doing some video editing and some research for future video and podcast topics, and I decided to come over to my bookshelf and pick up a book I haven't read yet. So what's really amazing is that most of these books have been gifts since I started the podcast. So I got this book as a gift about a year ago, The Architecture of War, and this is exactly how I like my books, nice and used. So I opened this book up to this page, and I noticed this fort in Antwerp. Now this is a World War II design. This design reminded me of something very familiar. Let's go check it out. Thank you to our video sponsor, The Daily News, bringing you the news since 1842. Support your local newspaper, The Daily News. At the turn of the 20th century, the United States Army Coast Artillery Corps was initiated, responsible for coastal, harbor, and anti-aircraft defense of the United States. Between 1901 and 1950, forts and batteries were set up along the entire coastline of the United States to deter and protect from any potential enemies attacking the U.S. Fort Crockett played a huge role in the U.S. Artillery Corps, but Fort Crockett gets a lot of attention. In this video, we are only focused on Fort San Jacinto and Fort Travis. I'm here on the extreme east end of Galveston Island, looking out at the entrance to Galveston Bay. Looking right over there, we can see Bolivar Peninsula, and right here we can see one of the remnants of a gun battery at Fort San Jacinto. This was part of a coastal defense system designed and built in the late 1890s to protect Galveston Bay. And this isn't the only one. There's another fort over on Bolivar called Fort Travis. Fort San Jacinto here in Galveston and Fort Travis over on Bolivar were designed to protect the entrance of Galveston Harbor for any enemy vessels that could potentially enter the harbor. This set of coastal artillery came in handy during World War I and World War II, as there were plenty of German U-boats and submarines in the Gulf of Mexico aimed at sinking American cargo vessels. Now, this gun emplacement here is not the only piece of Fort San Jacinto that you can see today. Let's go see what we can find. Now, luckily right now from the very east end of the seawall, the tide is out pretty far, so I can actually walk the beach around to Fort San Jacinto. But I better hurry, the tide is coming in fast. It's important to remember that the east end of Galveston Island that we know today was not the extreme east end back in the late 1800s. Most everything from about 6th Street down to where I'm standing now was essentially marshland, low-lying marshland, a very low-lying and muddy area. But similar to the Pelican Island of 1800s, there were small spits of land out here right at the entrance to the ship channel. The Texas government, after the Texas Revolution, established this area as a perfect spot to watch over the entrance to Galveston Harbor and Galveston Bay. And this area quickly became known as Fort Point. After about a 5-minute walk from the east end of the seawall, I have made it to one part of the existing Fort San Jacinto, right over here. Now, unlike Fort Travis on Bolivar, Fort San Jacinto is pretty much abandoned. And like most abandoned places, it has plenty of graffiti. I don't know how anyone back in the day lived without off. Fort San Jacinto actually took up quite a bit of land, not just these two little sections along the entrance to the ship channel, but a rather large area in what we know as the spoils area or the East End Flats. By 1921, Fort San Jacinto was made up of 3 gun batteries: Battery Hugh Mercer, Battery Julius Heilman, and Battery George Croghan, 2 of which still exist today. George Croghan and Hugh Mercer. An existing gun emplacement can still be seen at the very end of Seawall Boulevard. This was one of 4 guns, 3 of which were completely covered up by the East End Seawall extension. By the way, this area is by no means easy to get to. I decided to take the beach route today. Fort San Jacinto got its start in 1897 in an effort by the US government to protect the entire country's coastline. There was a small gun battery built in this location right about the level I am standing now, just a few feet above sea level, that was completely decimated during the 1900 storm. We can even see on this map Battery John Hogan that was abandoned right after the 1900 storm. And throughout the early 1900s, there were efforts made by the city of Galveston and the US government to expand the seawall as well as Fort San Jacinto for coastal defense. By the 1920s, the seawall extended all the way out to the extreme east end of Galveston Island, enveloping Fort San Jacinto in a protective barrier. I told you this wasn't easy to get to. Got a makeshift bridge here. There we are. On the east end, about half a mile down from Apfel Road, there is a gun battery, but it's actually very difficult to see today, but we're gonna be able to check it out. Let's go see if we can find it. So here we are on the Bolivar Ferry, making our way over to Fort Travis. So as we're here in the middle of the ship channel, we look over back towards Galveston and we can actually see Fort San Jacinto right over there. Today, this ship channel is one of the busiest in the United States. Through the Galveston, Texas City, and Houston ship channels, for nearly 2 centuries, it was deemed important to protect this passageway from enemies who might want to do harm or take over Galveston or Houston, especially during World War II when there were German U-boats in the Gulf of Mexico looking to do harm to the United States. Fort San Jacinto and Fort Travis were deemed extremely important for protecting the petrochemical facilities in Houston during World War I and World War II. Those petrochemical facilities were playing a huge part in fueling both of those wars. Today, it might seem hard to imagine a naval battle in Galveston Bay. But when they developed these forts, naval battles were a recent memory. There were naval battles and naval threats during the Civil War and even the Texas Revolution. So here on Bolivar Peninsula, at the entrance to Fort Travis, unlike Fort San Jacinto, Fort Travis is actually really well maintained for a century-old fort. One of the first things you notice about Fort Travis here on Bolivar is the scale. It's actually quite large. But when you look at old maps or schematics of Fort San Jacinto, it was actually even larger. Now, standing right here, looking directly out into the Gulf of Mexico, is easy to see why the Republic of Texas, after it gained independence from Mexico, wanted to start a fort right here. You could see enemy vessels coming from miles and miles away. And if you had the proper artillery, could actually fire on them from land instead of having to take it to a full naval vessel-to-vessel battle. One of the best ways to protect Galveston from a naval attack is from Bolivar Peninsula. The original forts that were built here at Fort Travis and Fort San Jacinto were both destroyed early on by hurricanes, just like most of the structures in Galveston and Bolivar in the early days. But at the turn of the 20th century, when the Coastal Artillery Corps came into the picture, why wouldn't you set up forts and artillery where previous militaries had already proven their worth? Fort San Jacinto and Fort Travis. Another very interesting thing about Fort Travis, just like Fort Crockett on Galveston Island, during World War II, there were prisoners of war held at Fort Travis. Many of those prisoners of war were German. Battery Kimball here was designed and built during World War I, but was quickly deemed obsolete as soon as it was realized that military aircraft could easily strike its gun emplacements that are located outside of the actual battery, just like this. So these giant circles right in here, right in the middle, is where the gun would set, aiming at the entrance to Galveston Bay. This book, The Architecture of War, this design reminded me of something very familiar. Viewing Battery Kimball from this side here, it's easy to see its defense qualities. Under this hill right here, it is built out with tons of concrete and rebar, with a giant earthwork right up here. The idea is if you were to fire at this bunker from the water, you would actually strike the earth instead of hitting the main structure of the bunker. For being over 100 years old, it's actually in pretty good shape, and you can see how solid this battery was constructed. Here at Battery 236, this one was built during World War II. Battery 236 was specifically built to fire upon U-boats and submarines that needed to surface to lay mines. Unfortunately, after it was constructed, it was deemed obsolete, as most mines were laid by aircraft, just to show how quickly technology was changing in the 20th century, especially during wartime. Right over here at Battery Davis, this battery was constructed in 1898. These sections right here is actually where the guns would be placed in order to fire directly out into Galveston Bay. If there are any enemy vessels entering Galveston Bay, they would be fired upon by Fort San Jacinto and Fort Travis. After World War II, both Fort San Jacinto and Fort Travis were pretty much shut down. War and technology had shifted so quickly, from naval attacks to attacks from the air, from batteries and vessels to air superiority, deeming both of these forts pretty much obsolete. But both of these locations remind us how important the Texas Gulf Coast actually is. During the Texas Revolution, during the Civil War, during World War I and World War II, these emplacements, these outposts, were locations that were important for protecting the bay, to maintain control of this area. Thank you so much for watching. If you enjoyed this video, please like and share, and follow us on all social media. We are everywhere. If you haven't yet, go check out the podcast. We have hours and hours of historical content on that podcast feed. You can find it anywhere you find podcasts. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time on Galveston Unscripted. So what's really amazing is that most of these books have been gifts since I started the podcast, or you guys actually bought these books for me by clicking the Buy Me a Book link in the description for me to buy books for research.